Hey nerdy knitters, Tanya here. Thank you for joining me for today's Nerdy Knitting Podcast. I invite you to get your favorite beverage and your knitting and settle in. Let's start with our knitting news. I saw an interesting video on YouTube last week, Christine Kelly's YouTube channel called Ewe University, EWE University, all about knitting and things about knitting and yarn and notions and all of those kinds of things. Well, the video was called Can Wool Save the World? And it was all about the different eco-friendly ways that wool can be used beyond knitting and textiles, but just really interesting things like how it can be used for gardening. And there's lots in the video. I can't even think of everything that was in there, but it was really interesting. If you'd like to learn more about how innovative the world is and using wool for so many different resources, it's a really interesting video, so you'll find that linked down below. The next thing I saw was an article online about a German care home for the elderly where they use alpacas and llamas as therapy care for the residents there. I thought that was such a neat thing. I've heard of dogs and small pets being used for therapy in hospitals and care homes, but I didn't know that larger animals as well, and well, especially alpacas and llamas, I hadn't considered their use in that regard. But there's lots of really interesting pictures on the animals in the care home and in the backyard with the residents, and it's just really neat to see. Now, the project is run by a woman called Michelle Dinter, and she is a specialist in animal-assisted intervention. You can see some of the pictures here in the article, so you'll find a link for this down below too if you want to go through and see more pictures. The last thing I have to share in this category isn't really news so much as a request for help. I'm planning a video coming up in the future that I want to talk about the things that new knitters don't know about that more experienced knitters do. Sort of like the things you wish you knew when you had first started knitting. So I would love your input and your feedback about the things that you know now that you wish you had known when you were a new knitter. Not necessarily the mistakes new knitters make, more about just those experience and tactics and techniques that you've developed that you wish you had known when you started knitting. So I would love it if you would share your experiences and your thoughts in a comment below. I'll be screenshotting all of those comments and sharing them in the video. So if you have some advice that you'd love to share or something that you wish you had known when you were a new knitter, then please tell me about it. And that brings us to our knitting questions. Last week we discussed linen yarn, Michelle's question about using other fibers besides wool because of the long summer weather that they have where she lives. I had some questions about how fiber was divided into different categories, so I thought we'd talk more about that today, about the different advantages and disadvantages, but in the general categories, not each fiber specifically. So like I mentioned last week, there are 4 different categories that yarns can fall within. That would be animal fibers, plant fibers, biosynthetic fibers, and synthetic fibers. So we'll break those down, talk about the different characteristics and when you might want to use that kind of fiber. We'll start with animal fibers. So things like sheep's wool, and then the animals that fall in the camelid family like camels, llamas, alpacas, and vicunas. Then you've got angora from rabbits and mohair, silk, cashmere, kiviut, and then bison and possum. So there's lots of different animal fibers that can be used to be turned into yarn, or other textiles as well. Now, all of these have some general advantages that they share. They're very warm, they're very lightweight, and they're very elastic. Now, these also depend on the different fiber itself. Like sheep's wool is very elastic. Alpaca is not so elastic. That tends to stretch out, but then it doesn't really snap back. Oh, and they're also biodegradable. But there are disadvantages. They can be scratchy, they can be itchy, they can be an allergen for some people. And of course, they need special care. And they can felt, which can be an advantage as well. Now, animal yarns can be used for pretty much any project that you want to use them for. They're even great for summer garments. And a lightweight animal fiber yarn, wool, is perfectly great for a sweater, a summer weight sweater or a tank top. Thicker yarns or yarns that hold in the warmth really well are great for colder weather as well. But this is just a versatile category that you can use these fibers for almost anything that you want to knit. Then we have plant fibers and biosynthetic fibers. I'm going to group these two together because biosynthetic fibers, while they require a synthetic process, use plant matter as their base. Things like bamboo. You can't really take bamboo and crush it up and turn it into yarn. It has to have some sort of chemical process to break that fiber down to be usable. And then other fibers like linen and cotton. Cotton, of course, is pretty easy to turn into fiber. It just has to be picked and then it can go through the spinning process. Linen takes a little more work than that, where it comes from the flax reeds or plants. It has to be crushed and broken down and soaked, and another process, but not quite as much as a synthetic process. But we'll just say that we'll group plant and biosynthetic fibers together. So you have things like cotton, linen, hemp, bamboo, and even corn and seaweed have been turned into usable fibers. Now, I've never run across corn and seaweed in a yarn. If you have, I would love to know your experience with those fibers. I think that would be really interesting to knit with. Now, the advantages of plant-based yarns is they're breathable, they're moisture wicking, they're strong and durable, they have really good drape, and they're also biodegradable. Their biggest disadvantages is the weight. They're very heavy and they're also inelastic. So unlike wool and other animal fibers, which think of an elastic, it can stretch, but then it can snap back. Wool has a really great elasticity. Plant fibers have none. They can stretch, but they don't snap back. They just get droopy. So if you've ever knit a big sweater in cotton yarn and you notice that it keeps sagging and growing over time, and then you end up with a tunic, it's because of that heaviness and that inelasticity. So those are just something to be aware of. So when I would use these yarns, I would use them for things where I want lots of good drape, like in a shawl or in different accessories, or for summer weight garments like tank tops and summer sweaters, or kids' clothes when you want easy care yarn, something that's really easy to care for with your kids and babies, or things that have seams or other methods to keep those yarns in place, because you need some extra structure where that inelastic yarn will tend to droop over time. But something I forgot to mention last week that I should have is there's another way around this, because I did say that you want to stick with garments that have seams to give some structure to that heavy inelastic plant fiber. But the one way around that is to look for a yarn that has some built-in structure. If you look for a yarn that is a chainette or a chain plied yarn, you'll see that if you look closely at yarns like that, I'll put a picture of one right here. If you look closely at it, it looks almost like a little I-cord. So these fibers have been spun and then sort of pre-knit into this little cord. And that cord, first it gives it a little lightness because they're usually hollow. So instead of like spinning and plying the yarn, where they could be like tightly spun or something like that, this hollowness makes it more light. So you reduce some of the heaviness of that yarn. But then it also adds some structure. So where we talked about how it's not very elastic, turning this little chainette yarn out or making that chain construction gives it some elasticity. So you could, if you've ever knit an I-cord, then you can sort of like pull on it and you can see that it's stretchy. And that adds some elasticity to a yarn that might not be very elastic. So that's a way around that rule about, not really a rule, but a recommendation just to knit projects that have seams. If you're knitting a sweater, you want something with seams for a plant fiber. If you have a chainette style yarn or something with some added structure to the yarn itself, then you can get around that rule and you can knit a seamless sweater. Now, I still wouldn't recommend something really heavily textured and cabled, because that'll be hard on your hands to knit a plant fiber that way because of that lack of elasticity. But you can get away with having a seamless garment if you use something that has a chainette construction. And then our next category is synthetic yarns like acrylic and nylon and polyester. And obviously, like, you'll find nylon in your sock yarns, polyester and acrylic are pretty common. Acrylic is very common. And these have some really good uses. They're very budget friendly. They're easy to care for. They hold their shape well. They're strong. They're non-allergenic, so they're a good choice for somebody who's allergic to wool. And they are water resistant. Now, the disadvantages of an acrylic is that they're not as warm as wool. They can hold heat, but they tend to feel more clammy, where a wool fiber will make you feel warm, but because it traps the heat within the fibers themselves. Acrylic sort of traps it against your skin, so you can start to feel sweaty or clammy. They're heat sensitive, so they can melt. They can hold on to odors and stains because of that water resistance. And because of what they're made from, it's a plastic that will end up in the oceans and landfills. Now, when you would use acrylic, when you want really easy care garments, like for kids or for people you're knitting for who you know are not going to like carefully wash and place something flat to dry, then an acrylic or something like that would be very beneficial to them because they can just wash it and dry it like they would their normal clothes. Charity knitting, a lot of charities will only accept something that's easy to care for. So it's good to have some acrylic in your stash. And it's also a good replacement for somebody who has an allergy to different animal fibers. And it's sort of like a general, you could probably replace most wool patterns with an acrylic if you wanted to. Like that's just a general guideline, because the process for creating the different yarns, they can change. Well, the different spinnerets or the ways they make the filaments themselves, that's where they can make all these different novelty yarns. So of course this is really dependent on the yarn itself. That's just a general guideline. So I hope that was helpful in helping you understand the different fibers and when you would want to use them. I have some links down below to some articles that I've written on my website about these different types of fibers, so you can go down and click and read more about like the knitting process, what they're like, how you should care for them, what they're like to knit with, everything like that. So if you'd like to read more about that, you can go check out those links. Now, before we move on to what is on my needles and off my needles, I just want to share about our sponsor for this episode. It would be Amazon Audible. I'd been listening to the first Outlander book, but I've listened to them so many times, it's more like comfort listening, but I need a break and I want to listen to something else. I haven't picked anything yet, but I'm thinking maybe Lord of the Rings again. Those are nice settle-in books, but my daughter mentioned Harry Potter, so we might listen to those books. It's been a long time since we've listened to them. We've been watching the movies again over our Christmas vacation. We still have the last two to watch. We prefer the earlier ones because they seem more fun and lighthearted, I guess. I mean, there's still some danger and stuff, but the last few sort of get darker and darker and more serious. And so we've been putting off watching those last few. But I think maybe listening to the books might be a fun thing. But if you'd like to give Amazon's Audible a try, you can get a 30-day free trial and 2 free audiobooks. You'll find the link down below. Now I have a finished object in my little Yarn Yay bag. Is anybody else a fan of the subscription boxes? I had a Yarn Yay subscription for a while. It was a Christmas gift from my husband last year, I think, or the year before. It has my finished shawl in it. Now this shawl uses a self-striping yarn. Gauge Dye Works, Whiskey in a Teacup. I don't think I have the ball band here. Nope. Got about that much left. I like to leave about 10% when I'm designing something, just for anybody else who knits it. So for gauge variations and things like that, it's a good idea to have a little left over for that. But they have this is their Whiskey in a Teacup colorway. It's one of their fingering weight yarns. I think it's their Merino cashmere base, the MCN. So it is self-striping, but you can see each stripe is exactly the same. Now they've really got to do some interesting math to make something that will grow like this, but still have the same width of stripes. So, to knit this one, you're going to have to look for something that has those long color changes. So not a sock yarn that has smaller stripes. It just would not work in this. You want a long color change yarn. So every time the color changes, I changed the stitch pattern. I had 4 different stitch patterns, really simple ones, stockinette garter, and then this eyelet, and then a really simple textured pattern. So I would switch between each of them with stockinette between each one, because I like stockinette more than garter personally. So you can see stockinette and then that mesh and then more stockinette and then some garter, stockinette and then texture, until we get down to this bottom part, the gray, which is a larger section of color. So I have some eyelets, an eyelet ridge here, and then some texture, and then a ruffle at the end, another eyelet ridge, and then the ruffle. So there's the shawl. I don't know how much of it you can see on here all at once. I'm still not quite sure about the ruffle. I haven't decided if I want to keep that or not. But it's a really simple pattern, really fun. So I will be working on getting that written up next week. Thoughts on the ruffle? Should I keep a ruffle or should I go with something more basic, like maybe a picot edge or something? But then you need a specific stitch count, and I wanted this to be easy to do. So whatever color change yarn you have, you're just working a basic top-down triangle shawl, and the stitch patterns don't require a specific number of stitches. So I'm not sure what other edging I could use. But anyway, I'd like your opinion on that ruffle. If you'd like to share it down below. Yes to the ruffle or no to the ruffle. And then another drawstring bag. This one was a freebie from Web's Yarn, I think. It's really nice. This one's a little thicker. I like this one. Now I'm making some progress on my sleeves for my master knitting program. I spent about pretty much the whole weekend working on these sleeves, so they are slowly coming along. I don't remember how many repeats I've finished, but now the front and the back are all finished. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the design. So I started with this motif that's in the center, and then I modified it for these right and left leaning cables on each side. One leans off to the right, one leans off to the left. Then I added the smaller basic 2/2 cables with the little twists around them. Those are right here. Well, right here. And then over on the side, one of the requirements for the master knitting sweater is to have baubles. There was a requirement for the number of cables you needed and your filler stitches and things like that. So I put the baubles off to the sides on either side with these twisted cables. And then a simple box stitch for my filler stitch on the sides. And planning the rib was the most interesting part, I think, because I wanted to run some of the cables right down to the rib and keep it pretty uniform. And I think it came out pretty nice. I like the way the rib looks. The basic 2/2 cables I ran right down to the cast on edge, and the bauble cables I just repeated the twist that it has, and that added a little bit of interest, I think. And I repeated that on the sleeves. So the center motif is another version of the center motif on the sweater itself, and I ran the cables right down to the cuff on here too. So that's what's off my needles and still on my needles, and I have some new projects that are going to be on my needles very soon. First is this design. It's a new design. It's going to be for a cable wrap. This motif here in the middle will run over the body of a wide shawl wrap thing, and then the motif here on this side is going to be along each edge of that central larger cable, and then an I-cord edge. So it's the first swatch, planning it out and working on that. We'll see how that develops. And in the last episode, I mentioned a Christmas gift my husband had gotten me, a gradient set of this blue yarn. I like blue. This is Urth Yarn's Merino gradient. It's 880 yards, 4 50-gram skeins of their extra fine superwash merino fingering weight yarn. So I've been spending some time looking at different shawl patterns and fade patterns and trying to decide what to do with that yarn, and I finally settled on an Ambah O'Brien pattern, her adventure shawl and scarf. I'll put a picture right here. I have enough yardage for the scarf size, but I'm probably going to make some changes because it's a little longer than I like. I'm on the shorter side, so the length I think was 84 inches long. It's a bit long. I want something a bit shorter and a bit wider. I don't have enough yardage for the big wrap size, but the scarf size is 10 inches wide and I think it was 84 inches long. So I'm going to reduce the length a little, and then that'll give me a little more for the width of the scarf. So it'll be more of a wrap. Not quite as large as her wrap version of this. It comes with 2 sizes. So I've got to sort out the numbers, but the pattern itself is very easy to follow. So her original wrap is intended to be used with like an Advent mini skein set. But of course I don't have that. I have these. So my plan is to work it as a fade pattern, starting with the lightest color and working to the darkest and then going back the other way. So I will take these 3 skeins, and while I'm caking them up, I will divide them in half. So I will have light at the edges, slowly fading into the darkest in the middle. So that is the plan for this yarn. So that's everything I'm currently knitting. But before we wrap up, I'd like to share a resource or a book that I would recommend, because this is the Nerdy Knitting channel and we like to talk about nerdy knitting resources. So one of the books I recommend is The Principles of Knitting. Now this is, I would say, like a masterclass in knitting. I would not recommend this book for brand new knitters. It's very can be very overwhelming. But for more advanced knitters or for intermediate knitters who would like to advance their skills, this is a good resource to have. But it has some pictures, but it's really a textbook. Like, it's just a lot of text. Now, for me, the one drawback is the terminology she uses. She's developed some of her own terminologies, but I understand like there's no specific standard terminology worldwide for different knitting techniques and things like that. Even a yarn over is called different things in different places, but she also has her own, so you have to change what you're thinking while you're reading the book. You have to remember her way of referring to things. So it's not like other book. Well, like Vogue Knitting, I can just flip to and quickly refer to the pictures and the captions and get the information I need. With this book, you have to sit down and not really have any distractions while you're reading to understand. But there's so much covered in this book, just so much good information that I do highly recommend it, but not for beginners. Like, I would recommend this for intermediate to advanced knitters who really want to focus on their skills and understanding the way knitting works, because she dives deep into things like that. Before we wrap up, just an announcement on the Fixing Your Knitting course that I'm working on, workshop course, I'm not sure what to call it yet. It'll be a series of videos, not just one, and there will be like a sort of introductory class, like a free class, focused on reading your knitting, because I think it's important to understand what's happening on your needles before you can fix your mistakes. I didn't want to make it part of the class because some knitters already know how to read their knitting, so it would be sort of a useless part for them. But then there are other knitters who think they know how to read their knitting, but they really don't. So I think that the reading your knitting part will just be like a free prerequisite that somebody can take before they take the course. So this week I sent an email out to my list, and I also posted here on YouTube on the community tab. You can click over if you want. There's still time to go answer the survey that I put in that email and in that link, just with one question about asking what things I should definitely cover in a class about fixing your knitting mistakes. And I had some responses that were a bit too far out of what I'd wanted to cover, but a lot of things that I hadn't thought about covering, like just simply tinking back. I hadn't even thought to cover that in this course, and that is something that people definitely should know how to do if they're trying to fix a mistake. Sometimes you don't have to rip out a whole section, you just need to go back a few stitches. So we'll definitely add that to the course. And there's some other things that came up that I thought would be really great to add. So the next step that I need to take is to collect those survey results and then open up the class to the very first group. I'm not going to open it to everybody. I'm going to open it to those on my email list first. I just want a small group that can go one class, one video at a time, and just tell me if there's anything I should include, anything that was not clear. And each video will have a small swatch that you will knit for yourself and then practice along with me. Like, say the first one would be something like just a dropped stitch. So you would knit a small stockinette swatch and purposely drop down a stitch to practice picking it up again. And of course, you follow along with the video and do it with me. And then we'll progress from there to other knitting mistakes. So for now, instead of just recording all the videos and putting it all up there and then opening it to students, I'm going to do one video at a time, have the students watch that and give me some feedback, and then we'll do the next video and then some more feedback. So if that's something that would interest you, then just join my email list. You'll see the link down below in the video description box, and you'll be notified when I open the doors to our first members. And if there's not enough interest on the email list, then I will open it up to the YouTube subscribers here. But first pick will be the email group. That's all for this week. Thank you for joining me for the podcast. If you're new here and you'd like to watch past episodes, I put together a playlist with this season's episodes, and you can watch that right here. I'll see you in the next video.